You know, I know a few techniques could help you manage that anger very effectively.
You zip it. We're walking.
Welcome, Gothamites, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City, and now the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Doing pretty well. Our reaction to last week's dive into the MCU was a positive one. Lots to talk about with Tony. Lots more to talk about with Tony. This week could be... It could be a psychologist's dream to talk about this character.
Is it though? Wait,
but
are
the
we
movie? I'm not speaking for you. I'm saying it could be. I don't know how you feel.
Let's be clear. We're not talking about Tony today. We're talking about Hulk.
Hulk. Yes. I mean, this is a character that was basically written for a psychologist.
I
right?
see what you mean. The movie that we saw was not great. Certainly not my favorite.
Before we get started on this week's episode, we got a couple things that might need announcing. One of them is MCU related. Drea, you did a article for Fandom on the new Loki, the Loki character,
right,
in anticipation of the new Loki series, which premiered last week. The second episode's already out now. Tell the folks where they can find that.
Well, if you go to fandom.com, you can find it, or you can just go to my website, drdreapsychology.com, and you can see all the articles that I've done for Fandom. And just to clarify, this article is not about the Loki show.
Right.
It's not about the new series. It's about the psychology of Loki throughout all the films he's been in.
Throughout, was it all the films?
It was, actually.
Wow.
It was all the films. Now, I think it's safe to say without spoilers that the Loki in the series is a variant, and I'll just let that sit.
Yeah.
What Fandom asked me to do was do a comprehensive profile of Loki, which includes what we know about him right up to the series.
Yeah.
So it included our introduction to Loki, and then his descent, I guess we can say, in the films.
Sure, his fall from grace.
Yeah, and all the different ways in which he's been mischievous and brilliant and charming, but also very, I'd say, very haunted by many, many things that he's experienced. So lots of topics in that article. One that I thought was interesting is the topic of suicide with a P. So it's like it's
suicide with a P.
With a P.
Got it.
It's also called pseudocide, and that's the interesting behavior where people will fake their deaths. And Loki does this in Thor: Dark World.
Yeah.
Where Loki intentionally fakes his death, and actually, our good friend Eric Goldman interviewed Tom Hiddleston for Fandom recently and asked him a number of things, and Loki said that faking his death was, Tom said, in his opinion, one of the most like a pretty serious example of his betrayal or his betraying characteristics.
Yeah.
And Eric also asked Tom about the comments that I made in the article. So he mentioned to Tom that that a clinical psychologist had written a psychology profile on Loki and gave a quote from the article, and Tom responded to it. He commented on it, and he actually is quite positive. I think he essentially agrees with me. I don't know if he's just being polite and nice in the interview, but he says very nice things.
No, and he also adds to it.
He does. And what he says about Loki is actually really insightful, and I think very accurate.
Well, I know that you like to poke fun at my theater past, but we actors like to dive into psychology of characters. So,
Yeah.
it doesn't surprise me that he has some astute observations of his own
Well,
on the character.
he is so good at playing Loki. It makes so much sense that he really truly understands the deep psychology of this anti-hero.
Yeah. And he's been living with the anti-hero for
It's been
over
in
10
him.
years. So
yeah. So that was truly a surprise and just a little bit surreal to hear him talk about his thoughts on my writing.
And what was the other video that everyone is seeing up at the tops of websites, and it's got you pictured there. People are sending it to you night and day.
Yeah, so Screen Junkies has it's also a profile. It's like a video clip essentially diving into the psychology of Loki. It's an assessment. And it's almost as if there's a bureau. I mean, it reminds me of Hellboy and other, maybe a little bit of S.H.I.E.L.D., but these bureaus that do investigative evaluations and assessments for various purposes, like just really scientific groups, units, offices in these, what I would consider behind the scenes, unknown areas of work, whether in partnership with government or on their own. And those units are not too different from what the CIA and FBI have, these research and psychology related offices. So Fandom and Screen Junkies decided to create this fictional bureau, the Bureau for Abnormal Psychology Research and Response. And then they created this character. I guess I'm like the chief psychologist who assesses various patients and targets. And in the video, it opens by saying that I'm running this bureau and that Loki's been assessed. And then it goes through the assessment, the findings, the diagnosis, and then the outcome.
Does that come with good benefits? Good dental working for the for that bureau? Okay, good to know. I'm
really
covered.
long hours though, and the outcome reveals that Loki gets a second chance given the features, the various characteristics that he shows. So it's kind of a cool framing. He's not exactly a villain. Yes, he's done some pretty mischievous things, but can he be redeemed? So you can find that on Screen Junkies and on Fandom.
Very cool. One other thing happened, and we didn't even tell our listeners about it.
Is this about Batman
It might be about Batman.
and Catwoman?
It's not about Catwoman.
Okay.
This is, it's not about what heroes do and don't do.
Okay.
They do.
They do.
No, this is about our anniversary. Our wedding anniversary, Drea, was May 25th, a couple weeks ago. And you got an interesting gift that you were excited about. You got a couple of interesting gifts that you were excited about. One of them we posted on social media. I got you 2 original animation cells from Mad Love, featuring Harleen Quinzel, one at her desk in her office, and the other assessing the Joker.
They're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful. And if folks are familiar with cells, it's just they're one of a kind, right? It's the single cell from that scene.
moment. Yeah. And the backgrounds are original on those. So those are one of a kind because, if there's movement within the cell, you keep the same background. You just move the acetate paintings and that's what gives you your animation, but you got the original backgrounds, so that just makes them even more collectible. But accompanying those was a little anniversary message. Why don't you tell folks what you got?
I was very surprised by this. You showed me a video clip of Kevin Conroy, and it opens with him saying my name. which
True.
is,
I mean, we should say he says your name.
Yes.
Like, it's not like, for folks who don't know, Kevin Conroy is on Cameo. And you can pay a little money and he'll do personalized messages for you and greetings for you from right there in his home. And he did one for Drea that was really quite long and intensive. I mean, like, I told him that you were a clinical psychologist and that we work on the Arkham Sessions podcast and you use Batman the Animated Series to inform the public about psychology, real life psychology, and he really went to town talking about the psychology of this character. It was really interesting.
it was really authentic. I felt that I know that he does these cameos as part of the work, right? Like when he signs up for Cameo, he's committed to completing these videos and sending them off. But it's very personalized, and it was very endearing to hear him talk about the importance of this work. So thank you for surprising me with that video. It's still so surreal and weird that he's talking to me, but it's very sweet and endearing, and I appreciate it.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Hulk, Drea.
Do we have to?
We have to. We have to talk about the Hulk. The Hulk's been around for a long time, 1962. And interestingly, the Hulk was not always green, depending on who it is you're talking to. There are several different histories. The Hulk was originally published as gray. Some say that it's because Stan wanted it to originally be gray in order to not look like any given ethnic race or people. Other people say that it was a mistake in the printing, that it printed gray, but he was always supposed to be green. Who knows the true story? I mean, Stan himself has said that he wanted it to be gray all along, and that he chose to make it green after seeing how it printed.
So he wasn't gray for very long. Like, he's been green since the 60s.
But it's interesting because this is a character that was designed, again, like Iron Man, to sort of be an anti-Cold War sentiment. It was meant to be sort of the dangers of nuclear weapons. You've got a character here who's studying gamma radiation and was exposed to too much of it, and out comes this inner being, this dissociative.
Yeah, this is the origin of the Hulk.
Yeah.
A brilliant scientist, a catastrophe.
Yeah.
Resulting in two personalities where one, I mean, it's very Jekyll and Hyde, right? One is a monster and the other is Bruce Banner, whose mind is still intact, still very brilliant. And let me just be clear. I really love the Hulk and the story.
As a character?
Generally. Yes. I did not like... Well, maybe I should be like just really candid here. I don't like Edward Norton.
Okay. I don't think you don't have to mince words. You don't have to stay, you don't have to hold back. This is easily in the majority of MCU fans' least enjoyed movies. I think this, Iron Man 2, Thor Dark World, like these movies usually appear at the bottom of lists of ranking from best to worst. So, you don't have to be...
I'm not alone here.
Yeah, you don't have to be careful.
But let me be more clear. Okay. I don't like
Edward
Norton. And I don't know why he was cast to be Bruce Banner. I just don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Ed Norton is that he is... he's a wonderful actor. He is acclaimed, and he brings the gravity to a character, to a comic book character, that I think Marvel was looking for at the time. He is notoriously difficult to work with, and apparently that did not change on this film. In fact, by the end, he was asked to depart, or he walked away, depending on who you're talking to. But I think he's fine as the scientist character. I don't think he's. I think what is interesting about Mark Ruffalo is he's got that meek personality that is the antithesis.
Right.
To
he's so perfect
to
as
the
Bruce
Hulk.
Banner.
Yeah. But when you're talking about a character that is going to prove to be incredibly intelligent, but also is physically fit. Because he is constantly on the run in Brazil from the government, okay, I'll buy Edward Norton as the character. This is a character that's gone through a significant amount of changes over the years. And you say you like the Hulk as a character. I have always hated the Hulk as a character. As a hero. I mean, I think if you're doing a sort of a personality short story or something on the Hulk, then that's fine. But I am not going to read an ongoing series of his, because ultimately it comes down to when Bruce Banner gets mad, he becomes a creature that will destroy anything and everything around him, regardless of who you are. Like, if an old lady keys his car, he will become the Hulk. And he'll smash his own car.
His threshold might be a little different than that. But I see what you mean, and I disagree slightly. I feel like that is at the core of the psychology here. In many ways, this is about letting ourselves get carried away by an emotion. In this case, it's anger. And this is of course a metaphor. He becomes another person, a very different person, a rageful, violent, simple-minded, monosyllabic. I mean,
No. He says Betty later. That's 2 syllables, Drea. You got to give this creature credit.
Okay. So I think that it's sometimes hard to relate to that, but I do. What I love about, now we're not supposed to talk about this character further down the MCU because we'll get there.
Yeah, you're not allowed.
But I think what I just want to mention is that whole idea that this guy is managing, here he is, a very intelligent, and I think interpersonally interesting guy who is constantly having to control this thing inside him, this emotion that he doesn't like. Mm-hmm. And I think that in the comics and later in the films, there's this very overt mention of this tension and this duality being so emotionally painful that sometimes Bruce considers suicide, that he considers ending his life or ending both of their lives because of the hardship that this brings him.
Yeah.
He does not want to bring harm to other people, but certainly there's something about the helplessness here and the lack of control.
And we should say that he doesn't just contemplate suicide. There's an allusion later on, which actually comes from this film, not something we saw, but something we could have seen. Ed Norton, when he came onto the project, rewrote a significant amount of scenes of dialogue.
Really?
And apparently he really only touched the dialogue, but it was always dialogue from his scenes. He didn't really touch any of the other stuff that Zach Penn wrote for the scenes that don't involve his character. But he really wanted to make sure this character seemed authentic to him. He's one of those actors.
Okay.
So much of his dialogue is written by himself, though the WGA would not give him a screenwriting credit. And there's a scene that he specifically wrote where Bruce Banner flees to the Arctic and takes a gun and inserts it into his mouth, pulls the trigger, and then we cut away. And when we cut back, the Hulk is spitting the bullet out. Mm-hmm. And
that's mentioned later.
And that is mentioned later by Mark Ruffalo. And I can only imagine what Edward Norton must have felt when a scene that he wrote but was rejected, not shot or not included in the film, was later referred to by his replacement. But yeah, so he's a character who's not only contemplated suicide, but has actively attempted it. The Hulk won't let him die. And that is an interesting thing on its own. In fact, we even see toward the end of this film, not even knowing if the Hulk will come out, he hopes that he will, and he leaps from, or I shouldn't say leap, he falls from a helicopter in the hopes that the Hulk is unleashed and goes up against another character, Abomination, who was an abomination. We should talk about the film. You were incredibly surprised and maybe even confused in the beginning to realize that the opening title sequence is literally the origin story of Bruce Banner and the Hulk.
Okay, I'm going to say something, but you've already mentioned that this film is commonly disliked.
Yeah.
Right? I did not like the opening of this film. The opening credits, I think, was a part of the movie. Like, that was I saw images and flashes of explosions and people and close-ups of faces. I saw emotion. I saw Hulk. I saw transformations. Betty was in a hospital bed. Like, what happened? What is going on?
Yeah.
I really don't like, I mean, you told me, like, okay, this is all what we need to know to set up the movie. And I get that style, but I don't like that. And here's why. While you're showing us the credits, you're fast forwarding, skipping through, sort of just flooding us with the origin. Mm-hmm. And all of that is important to me. I want to know the nature, the context of the traumatic event, what led up to it, what happened, what was the immediate result. And I think generally we get the sense that, yes, there was an explosion in the lab, Betty was injured, Hulk emerged, pounded on things, and then disappeared. That's what we know.
Yeah.
And the movie opens with a display, just the digital day, like the digital numbers of how many days since he's had an incident. So we get a good sense of how long it's been since the tragedy. But obviously, as a psychologist, I'm missing out on so much. I either have to refer to the comics or to what we know about this character. This movie isn't giving me very much about Bruce. You
mean in the pantomime that you see throughout the opening title sequence, the people doing very dramatic turns and looks and walking out the door, you didn't get all of the emotional impact you need? This was really a result of the fact that there had been another movie just a couple of years earlier.
That's the Eric Bana one?
Yeah, the Eric Bana, directed by Ang Lee. And it is the emo Hulk. I mean, it's very talky, which, by the way, I don't mind. When you're talking about a character that is just Hulk smash, I don't mind a little more emotional intelligence put into the film, but it was not well received and became cartoony by the end, which I didn't care for. But it dives into Bruce Banner's relationship with his father, his abusive relationship with his father.
His childhood.
Yeah.
So much. And so I like that. I'm not necessarily saying...
But they just don't want to rehash it. It's the same story.
Yeah, I guess you're right. But then it leaves me with wondering, with this Ed Norton version, I don't know much about him in his formative years. I don't know what other experiences he's had with relationships or with his own transformation before the Hulk. Who is he? Who is Bruce Banner in this version? Mm-hmm. And what that does is it just we just dive right into the tension with Bruce and the Hulk without a good understanding of what has led psychologically, sort of what has led to those moments.
It's interesting that you're saying this because not only do I agree with you, last night as we were rewatching it, I was struggling so much to just care about any of the characters because Bruce doesn't really converse with anyone. He keeps to himself. He's in Brazil and he's learning breathing exercises, which I'm sure we will talk about. And he is learning how to cope and manage his heart rate, because apparently if his heart rate reaches like 200 beats a minute, he will become the Hulk. Now, this seems a little arbitrary to me because, my heart rate could go up that high simply by sprinting. And we do see that he is running away from baddies a couple of times, bullies, and even government agents who've come after him. And he seems to, just by doing the cardio, his heart is being worked up to the point that the Hulk is going to come out. So it really has nothing to do with his emotion in the course of this film.
That's a really good point.
It's just, at one point he refuses to have sex with Betty because he can't get his heart too worked up. And so there's this suggestion of, he doesn't even have to get angry at this point. His heart rate just has to go up. And so that seems interesting to me, in not an interesting way. And, but as I was watching it, the first time that we're ever really introduced to a character where I feel like we're supposed to care, or we're supposed to get like little inklings of heartstrings being tugged, is he shows up to an old pizza parlor that I'm assuming we're meant to believe was like his place with Betty. Like, this is where they would go. Maybe they had their first date here. We don't know. But he seems to know the owner, whose name is Stanley. I can only assume that's a Stan Lee reference. But he's an older gentleman who looks very much like Albert Einstein. And this guy has apparently owned this pizza parlor for quite some time. And he refers to Betty. They talk, this is the first real conversation he's had in the entire movie. And I want to say it's like 40 minutes in. And even then, Stanley serves no purpose other than to basically serve as this exposition. Like, this is one of our places. Oh, and by the way, in about 5 minutes, Betty's going to show up with her new boyfriend, Ty Burrell,
who plays
from Modern Family.
He's a psychologist. He's a psychiatrist.
Yeah, he's a head shrinker. According to Stanley, but a good guy apparently, which is
what do you mean?
Good
but a good guy? No, you said he's a psychiatrist, but a good guy.
No. Because when you talk film and television, and especially if someone uses the term head shrinker, you automatically assume this person is probably a jerk or some sort of pompous windbag,
or that would be the person who becomes the villain.
Right. Yeah. And it'll be like a love triangle. You stole my woman. Therefore, I am going to become a monster. And throughout the course of the film, this psychiatrist not only remains a good guy, but even at the end comes right out and goes up against Betty's father, Thunderbolt Ross, and remains a good guy. So, Drea, I want to make sure I find out from you how you felt about the fact that if not your profession, at least someone in the general field of psychology and psychiatry remained a good, solid character throughout the course of the film.
He even talks a little bit about his own values as they relate to his profession.
Yeah.
You get the sense that although he has alliances, and he clearly cares about her and probably wants her not to go back to her ex-boyfriend.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, he's an upstander. Like, he's just a very well-intentioned person who would never want any harm done. It sort of gets down to that fundamental ethical principle: do no harm. Like, I don't want to be involved in anything that would be harmful.
Yeah.
And if I had the opportunity to be helpful, I will do so. And he clearly is in that space. Yeah.
The thing that I don't like about Betty in this particular case is that I don't feel like they are giving her anything as well. She is, of course, played by Liv Tyler. And I want to like her, but she's given nothing to work with. She basically becomes the doting character who, upon seeing her ex-boyfriend and lover, instantly leaves her new boyfriend behind, invites her old boyfriend to the house in order to get more exposition. She is left being the one who cries to daddy on a regular basis. Please don't do this, dad. Please don't do this. Don't talk to me ever as your daughter again. Like she is used only as a tool throughout the film.
Right.
There's no emotional connection between these two.
And has no choice but then to weaponize her relationship as his daughter. And I agree with you. I like her very much, and she maybe wasn't given enough to work with.
Yeah.
But she is necessary. We need her to help us understand that Hulk can be
Tamed.
Yeah, well, tamed, but also that even when he's the Hulk, Bruce is there. His emotional capacity, his decision making, some of his cognitive acuities, like that's there. They just need to be reached. They need to be accessed.
Let's talk about this. Let's go ahead and talk about Bruce / the Hulk. We've often been told in the comics that it's a dissociative state, that he has no memory as the Hulk. In fact, even in later versions with Mark Ruffalo, there's this understanding that he does not really know or understand what he's doing as the Hulk, that this is a completely different character. And of course, when you're talking about the Hulk, you have to go ahead. We have to go down this well-trodden path, Drea, of the ego and the id. Describe this character of the Hulk as you understand him from the perspective of someone who has done a significantly more training than really probably most people who are listening to the show.
Well, the ego and the id don't come up for me as some of the first thoughts I have about this character, but since you brought it up, that is a framework that Freud introduced.
Yeah.
It's actually 3 different principles of the self. The id being the most subconscious impulses. These are the things that we might want to do. These are our desires. These are sort of basic needs. The superego is essentially fundamentally what we are supposed to do, what society tells us to do. And the ego is the most balanced form of the self, a mixture of the two, but also a sense of authenticity. This is the person who I believe I am to be. And this is the ego is managing these other forces. And I wouldn't say that this is a very reliable paradigm. It's an interesting one, but I'd rather, when we talk about the Hulk and Bruce Banner, before we even get to possible diagnoses, this is to me more of a metaphor. As I said before, This is not like, obviously we're in the fantasy realm. There's no existence of this Jekyll and Hyde situation. Right. Although it's one that is extremely popular in literature. And I think the reason why that's the case is that we are fundamentally fascinated with what would happen if we did let ourselves let go and give in to these emotional impulses. What would that look like? How would that feel? And my suggestion is that the Hulk and Bruce Banner remind us that he's a monster. You can't free your emotional expressions. You can't give in, entertain, and immerse yourself in really negative emotions, because there could be a really devastating outcome. That's probably an exaggeration, but I think that's the lesson here. I think that's the warning, like we've got to be incredibly thoughtful and in our management of our emotions. And if we don't do that, there could be some like really destructive results.
Yeah.
Well, what do you're a well-read person. You've probably seen versions of this outside of comics. Like what is your take on this model?
For me, it's the Jekyll and Hyde model. It
Yeah.
is literally two different characters. One super intelligent and has gotten himself into a problem where this inner rage comes from. Now, in the comics, eventually it's sort of determined through Doc Samson, a character that you would probably appreciate, Drea, sort of a superhero psychologist. They end up uncovering a significant amount of childhood trauma that Bruce has had throughout his life and has carried with him throughout his life. So apparently he's already emotionally messed up before he even has the accident with the gamma rays. And so the gamma rays are responsible for unleashing all of that trauma onto the world. Now, originally, this character was not quite so triggered. This was a character that the Hulk would come out at night, just about every night, just in general. Just
Like a werewolf?
yeah, like the sun goes down, Bruce Banner becomes the Hulk.
Interesting.
Over time, that became, and I would say over a short amount of time, that then became more about "Don't make me angry," which became basically the mantra for the Bill Bixby version of the Hulk in the 70s TV shows and TV movie. Bill Bixby, who we see in this film in an episode of The Courtship of Eddie's Father. But yeah, there is just this understanding that it is two separate characters entirely. And really, we're not allowed to talk about it. Eventually, they merge to some degree, and maybe even become that version of that idealized version that Freud talks about. But
And in the comics, there are times when he's much more conversational.
when he's Grey Hulk, when he's Joe Fixit, he's probably even more terrifying because he's intelligent. He is smart. He is equally brutish, but has reasoning abilities. But yeah, the moment that he became Grey Hulk, where they basically decided, the writers decided, no, look, those early incarnations of the Hulk were real. Those weren't an accident. That wasn't a mistake in printing. That wasn't a change that was made later. Like, he originally was Grey Hulk, who then became Green Hulk, who is just sort of the savage monster. And now we're getting back to Grey Hulk. They ended up naming him Joe Fixit. And this character is a bit more, is more intelligent and speaks in more than 1 and 2 syllable words. But yeah, that, again, for me, this is a character that's not even really all that interesting because it's two separate characters. I'm far more interested in the Bruce Banner story than I have ever been in a Hulk fight. Like, I just don't care who Hulk smashes. And it's always going to be someone bigger and brutish, like the Abomination, who is also
That was
going to be
horrible. Yeah. So that fight, I wonder your take on that, because for me, I just felt that it was boring because you have these two huge monsters just, smashing into each other and destroying cars and buildings. And when did this come out? Like 2009?
This is 2008, same year as Iron Man.
Yeah, same year as Iron Man. Wow. And I think, like, look, audiences love big beasts, squaring against each other. Who is stronger? Who can best the other? The whole Godzilla versus King Kong is the epitome of this, right?
Yeah.
Certainly, there's no other match for this kind of powerful creature. And then you've got, but yes, there is. And then here's the introduction to not only is he as strong, but he is an evil version of him.
Yeah.
And it just isn't interesting. It's done before. I felt like that was basically what Iron Man was about.
Oh, okay. So now we're going down a path that has bugged me since phase one. Phase one, especially, is literally the same story across all the movies. It is a character who builds something or becomes something that another character wants, and that other character then will become a version of that character. So we've got Ironmonger, then we've got Abomination, later we'll have Whiplash, then we've got Loki, then we, like every, we've got Red Skull, every villain ultimately wants the same thing, which is whatever the magical thing, whether it's armor or gamma rays or whatever, they just all want the same thing. So phase one of the MCU is pretty boring to me, to be honest. Once we get to the Avengers, things start unfolding in a bigger scale. But yeah, those movies are all basically the same movie to me.
Well, and that's why I'm sort of annoyed, because shouldn't all these be origin stories? But you just gave me the Hulk and you skipped the origin story, the traumatic event, the pivotal, essential, the cataclysmic moment. And I am that person who needs to know what that was about and what were the losses, what were the gains, what happened in the context. And like you mentioned, what happened before that? What was his upbringing like? Who is he? So when you see Ed Norton becoming Hulk in this movie, it's not as interesting because you don't know him and you don't know Hulk, and Hulk is too simple.
Yeah.
So you don't really. It's not layered.
I don't disagree. I am not someone who needs to see the origin in every movie. As far as I'm concerned,
I need to see Bruce as a child, see his parents shot over and over and over again.
So later with Peter Parker, you're going to want to see Uncle Ben get shot. You're going to want to see the wrestling bit. You're going to want to see like all that stuff over and over and over again. Because we come right in on Peter Parker. We'll talk about that when we get to him. But
we're going to get to Peter Parker?
Yeah, because that's pre-Endgame. So we will get to Peter Parker in Civil War.
Oh, that's right.
So yeah, okay. So that's interesting. Where other people like to instantly go to ego, id, that didn't even really occur to you. But you're also not a Freudian.
No, and most people aren't. Like, I don't mean most people in my field. I mean most people. Period.
Yeah. Well, it's been a long time since his.
Yeah.
Since his, but let's be fair, this movie or this comic was created in the 60s. So there were probably a lot of Freudian writers and psychiatrists and psychologists who still fell in line. But that's where a lot of people want to go. They want to go with, that character. So I want to talk a little bit about what we see in the beginning, because when we looked at that opening sequence, we got to see these breathing exercises. We got to see all of this stuff about basically just how he copes. And it's funny because when you watch a movie with you, occasionally words will slip out. And I'm not even sure you're talking to me. I think you're just identifying things that you see, and you instantly just went coping responses. And I want you to talk about that. I want you to talk about what you have seen, because I do think this movie does provide a pretty strong foundation for what this person is doing to maintain their stress.
Yeah, he shows us one of possible. Actually, there are multiple ways he can manage his anger. And this is where, of course, he's not simply managing his anger. He's managing his whole sympathetic nervous system. Like this is really about calming the body, not so much dealing with anger in particular. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like I think that what he and he has a mentor, which I was happy to see that he has a specialist who's showing him, this is how you breathe. This is what your diaphragm should feel like. This is the control you need. These are the patterns. Like there's somebody who's giving him these instructions. And of course, this is helpful because it allows us to understand that he doesn't just know coping strategies. He had to be taught how to manage his body. And the guy, and we don't really get to know this guy, but the guy that's giving him this this mentorship and this guidance is specifically teaching him how to breathe in order to slow down his internal system.
Okay.
And it's still helpful for anger management, but it's not specific to that. So I think that that's something that has to be clear. That breathing exercise that they do is essentially diaphragmatic breathing. It's slowing down the breath. So you might notice if you're panicked, if you're nervous, if you're stressed, you might notice you have very shallow breathing, like it's very quick. It's fast paced. People like when this happens to me, I feel like I'm like gasping for air almost. And so something that is very helpful and I would consider almost like emergency self-care is to slow down the breath. And you can do this at any point, but the way that they do it in the movie is they sit down cross-legged and they face each other and he tries to mirror his mentor's slowed breathing. It's important that as he's taking breaths, he brings that breath down to his diaphragm, so down to the core around where the belly button is. And even to kind of visualize, I love that he's watching his mentor, like looking at his, the shape of his body even. Like this is what your body looks like when you're bringing this air, your breath down there. And then similarly, when you're exhaling, you're trying to slow down the breath. Okay, so assuming you're in normal situations, but you're feeling stressed, anxious, and want to calm yourself, this is the basic instruction. If you can, and if you've never done this before, it's best to try it lying down because you can actually feel, there's the sensation of the diaphragm that you can feel a little bit more. So that's how we usually teach clients to start this process. So for instance, you can lie down on a flat surface like the ground or a yoga mat. You can have a pillow under your head and even under your knees if that's more comfortable. Essentially get in a comfortable position. And it's helpful to place one hand in the middle of the upper chest. So right where if you took a deep breath, you would kind of feel that raise. And then the other hand goes on the stomach, like just right below the rib cage. For me, that's like pretty much where the belly button is. And at that point, just inhale slowly, breathing in through the nose, drawing your breath down toward the stomach. And you'll see, this is why we have our hand there. You'll see your hand raise a little bit. It should push upward against your hand. And don't press down, just have your hand rest gently. And then when you exhale, tighten the abdominal muscles and let the stomach fall downward while exhaling through your mouth. It's helpful to do this for several minutes, if you can, at least 5 to 10 minutes each day. And I often tell clients, like, don't do this when you're stressed. Like when you're practicing, just try this when you're in a relaxed state so that you can see the movement, get a sensation of what it's supposed to be. And the whole breathing through the nose thing is interesting. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm congested today.
Yeah.
I'm congested most of the time, right? So if it's hard for me to breathe through my nose, I shouldn't have to do it. It is stressful. So it's okay to take those breaths in through both your mouth and nose or through your mouth if that's more comfortable. And the other caveat is if I do too much slow breathing, that sometimes triggers anxiety and panic. So I'm actually one of those people that when I'm doing yoga or some version of a relaxation exercise, that slowed breathing might actually trigger something. It might trigger is a very sensitive word, but it may, that attention to my breathing may result in a level of anxiety simply because I'm paying attention to the breathing. And all of us can overcome that, but I'm just mentioning that in case people try this and it's uncomfortable for them. I should continue to do it pretty frequently until I'm more comfortable with it.
I'm sure you would already tell us, but what are some of the benefits of this particular breathing, this method, this almost meditative state?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are some obvious ones, right? You're slowing down your breathing rate, you're strengthening the diaphragm, you're improving your stability in the core of your body. So there's just a sense of strengthening the body itself. That's really important. But more specifically, and probably more relevant to the show, you're lowering your heart rate and your blood pressure. You're reducing oxygen demand. You're promoting relaxation. And for those of us who have anxiety and stress, these are good moments. This is that restorative exercise that we need to calm the body. Sometimes some of the after effects include calming the brain too. All those worries and thoughts might start to dissipate a bit. And of course, there are ongoing, what I would say like long-term health benefits. If you do this breathing exercise and add a meditative component, maybe you're closing your eyes and visualizing, maybe you're counting the breaths, that will lead to possible reductions in chronic stress. It could increase joy and happiness. It can assist with lifting mood. And for some people who have disorders like depressive disorders or anxiety disorders, it is an element of their treatment. So it's interesting to me that he's doing this to manage he's essentially using his breath to manage his heart rate, which is totally accurate. But they never really bring in an element of emotion regulation to this. So I'm kind of disappointed.
I see. Speaking of regulation, I wanted to throw something at you. You didn't know this was coming. So
no.
I'm without warning, I'm throwing something at you. I want to get your take. In doing a little research on the film and on the character, particularly from sort of a psychological analysis point of view, I came across an article in thriveworks.com, their blog. I guess they're a counseling and coaching organization, and they have a blog where a psychiatrist by the name of John Snyder, who's got a PsyD in psychotherapy in San Francisco, he did a diagnosis of Bruce Banner, specifically the Hulk, and then a little justification. I guess you used diagnosis and justification as terms. He says that he believes that the Hulk would be exhibiting classic symptoms of intermittent explosive disorder with underlying antisocial personality traits.
What?
And then because he's constantly found with little to no pants and shirt, he wants them to request an investigation to rule out possible exhibitionistic sexual paraphilia disorder as well. I think that's more of a joke than anything else. That's the understanding that this psychiatrist can't know that it's because he is outgrowing his clothes. It's just, hey.
Why doesn't he know he's outgrowing his clothes?
I think it's, hey, this patient is constantly, well, it says that that Mr. Hulk is undergoing psychological evaluation for the purposes of placement and treatment planning within the Bureau of Prisons after he was found sleeping semi-nude in public again. So he's woken up, and but he says that it would be intermittent explosive disorder with underlying antisocial personality traits, and I wanted to get your take on that.
You said he was a psychiatrist?
He is a psychiatrist.
So he has an MD.
A PsyD.
Well, this is already, I'm a little sus.
He might be a psychologist. John Snyder,
certainly.
PsyD, psychotherapy. Yeah.
PsyD is a doctorate, and you are a psychologist if you have a PsyD and you're licensed. If he's listed as a psychiatrist.
Okay, so for the sake of the article does say clinical psychologist diagnoses the Incredible Hulk.
Okay.
So
yeah.
You know.
All right, that sounds right.
But he is referring to the American Psychiatric Association, which I think might be why
we do. Yeah, that's fine. Thanks for clarifying that. Overall, I think this is a very illuminating assessment Well, let's move backwards here. I'm assuming that, as you mentioned, the mention of a paraphilia. Paraphilias are mental illnesses that specifically refer to sexual dysfunction or some related concept. So exhibitionism is a repeated, unhealthy habit of exposing your body to people.
Right. We shouldn't say that being an exhibitionist means you have a disorder. It just means that if it's pervasive,
Sure.
you have a disorder.
And, in class, when I taught this, that came up. There's, and this isn't where our show will really take a lot of focus, but there are still disorders in the DSM that refer to relationship and sexual habits that actually are totally fine and healthy and safe. The reason this is still a disorder is if it is like an addictive thing, somebody has to do this in order to experience pleasure, and that they're imposing their nakedness onto other people.
So when you think of the classic flasher image of the naked man in the trench coat just exposing themselves, that would be a disorder.
I would have to further assess whoever that person is.
Okay.
But,
all right. I'm not going to let you. I'm not going to let you get anywhere near that person.
I really don't want to. So that I'm just going to put that on the shelf, because I don't think really that's where we'll spend time. But
Bruce doesn't have that problem.
No. It's not his fault that his clothes don't fit him.
Right.
And he's, waking up naked.
Yeah.
And I get that. I'm understanding that this psychologist is only focusing on Hulk, not on Bruce Banner.
Yeah, that appears to be the case.
So we're only looking at aggressive, violent behaviors, very impulsive anger and tantrums. And that is consistent with intermittent explosive disorder.
Okay.
What you'll see, and I have to say that I've only diagnosed children with intermittent explosive disorder, but you can use this as a diagnosis for adults. This is kind of what it sounds like. It's an impulse control disorder that's characterized by sudden episodes of unwarranted anger. And so you'll see intensified hostility, aggressive outbursts, like an explosion. Somebody will seem totally fine, and then they'll go into this rageful state.
So it's not even, it can be triggered by something very, very little, like, say, an old lady keying his car.
It could.
He could suddenly Hulk out, and it doesn't seem to be, I guess, proportionate to, like a proportionate response to the offending action.
Yeah, and it's almost as if it's like a fire hydrant, right? That once the water's out, it's gone. There's this, it's the tension builds quickly, and then the emotional explosion happens, and then there's this relief that happens immediately after. Some people with IED do report that they experience feelings of remorse or embarrassment after the incidents, but not all do. And this is why I wouldn't necessarily think of this disorder. Usually you see this emerge in early childhood and in adolescence. Here you have somebody, it's Bruce. If we think about this film in particular, Bruce isn't even experiencing anger. He's experiencing a high heart rate. And then he's agitated. Like, remember that scene in the bottle factory or whatever, where like many men are holding him down?
Yeah.
And he's like, you don't want this to happen. There's guns on him. And then he transforms into the Hulk.
Yeah.
So my understanding of that is, as he's continued to get, he's irritated, he's agitated, and that leads to him becoming the Hulk. Once he's the Hulk, then he's rageful. That's where that emotional piece comes in, and he smashes and destroys and kills people in this film.
Yeah.
So is this a proper diagnosis for him? I don't think it takes into account Bruce Banner. It's just sort of looking at the Hulk's behavior. And the other piece that this specialist added is antisocial personality disorder.
Yeah. They do seem to differentiate between different types. So like, it's not necessarily. They say that it can vary in severity and range from verbally abusive behavior to severe violence. Care should be taken to distinguish the antisocial behavior that Mr. Hulk exhibits from the psychopathic behavior exhibited by his colleague Magneto. And he brings in
What?
He brings in, other characters from the Marvel universe. So clearly he's not talking about this character, but where he's saying, whereas Hulk's violence is effective, expressive, and emotionally driven, Magneto's violence is instrumental, calculated, and goal driven.
Okay.
So he's differentiating the types of antisocial personality.
And there aren't types. There aren't necessarily those two types of antisocial personality
I didn't go to school
disorder.
for this, so.
And we're kind of getting in the weeds here. I wouldn't necessarily think of antisocial personality disorder. Again, because you have this man who this is why I hate this movie so much. How old is he? Is he in his 40s? Like up till the moment where he becomes Hulk.
Well, Tim Roth as Blonsky says he's 39. So where do you put Tim Roth and Edward Norton together in the spectrum
I guess they're
of
around
contemporaries? They're probably right around that 38,
age.
39, 40 range.
So it is unlikely that a single event will then lead to the development of antisocial personality disorder. That is pretty much something you'll see early on in childhood, adolescence, and especially in the late teens and early 20s. You're going to start to see some behavior that violates norms, sometimes abusing animals and people, lack of remorse. That's not this guy. Now, the event he experienced created a duality where Bruce Banner, we could very much agree, is experiencing PTSD. And Hulk, this alter ego, is the symbol of the manifestation of his anger, his rage, the things that triggered him. Like, I could see this conceptualized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mm-hmm. And in a few scenes, Ed Norton is, I think there's at least two scenes. There's one in the shower. He looks up at the shower head and suddenly sees a machine gun or
gunfire coming at him.
Yeah. And then he reacts and he falls to the ground and he's in a fetal position. He's just very shocked by that. In another scene, he's asleep and he has a dream about the assault. These are the things that happened after he became the Hulk.
Yeah.
So Bruce Banner, and this is interesting, Bruce Banner is having nightmares and flashbacks about things that happened to Hulk.
Yeah.
So his subconscious is wrestling with and managing the trauma that Hulk experiences.
Right.
And I would imagine that the transformation itself is traumatic. Each time he loses control, turns into a different person, and then wakes up, that's a dissociative experience, and it can be traumatic.
Right.
And then finally, we have to talk about, speaking of dissociative, DID, dissociative identity disorder, which we've talked about a few times on the show. This was previously known as multiple personality disorder, which is a mental disorder that is characterized by the maintenance of at least two distinct and enduring personality states. And he has more than distinct personality states. He has two different bodies.
He's probably the closest thing that we've ever seen to an actual case of what DID would be considered, right?
Yeah, no memory of being the other person. So we call those memory gaps. Forgetfulness about what happened, or complete, like not even knowing what happened between altered states. Mm-hmm. That's pretty consistent here. Often the critical events or some of the experiences that may have led to DID include trauma. And we don't know a lot. Again, we don't know a lot about his earlier life, but we do know that being in this life-threatening lab disaster is traumatic. Seeing his girlfriend almost die from it, that's traumatic. Mm-hmm. And so that fits here. So I see some connections.
But at the end of the movie, the very last thing we see of Bruce is he's in a shack, breathing, meditating.
Yeah.
And we see that it's been 31 days since his last event. And it's suddenly, he doesn't appear to be in any stress or anxiety. He is meditating and breathing, and his eyes suddenly go green and the counter goes down to 0 and he smiles. So that suggests to me that he is learning to control it in that moment. So then your DID almost becomes, I don't know if it's null and void, but if it gets to a point that he then begins to interact with that character and begins to control that character when it comes out and when it doesn't, then would you then continue to say that DID is an option?
I don't know that we know exactly what is happening there. I think that's him feeling what I would consider a premonitory urge. A premonitory urge is a subtle, almost a physiological experience that someone has. It's like a little sign that you're, that word is used actually for people who have Tourette's, like they might have a physical tic and they just feel that little impulse happen. That's what I think that is. And I wonder if that's indicative of him now having a better understanding of when he will transform. And I agree with you. If he's controlling it, okay, that's interesting. That's new, but we can't rule out DID.
Okay.
Now we've talked about DID. It's a very controversial diagnosis, but some people who claim to have DID say that under the right circumstances, they can switch, but they still do not feel, that the personalities interact with one another. In other words, when they switch, that other personality takes over.
Right.
They're no longer there in the subconscious, and that personality becomes the dominant personality. So are we seeing that with him? I don't think there's enough information for us to have that conclusion.
Right.
And the last thing I'll say, I mean, gosh, there are so many things we've mentioned here.
See,
but
I told you, this character is a psychologist's dream.
It's bipolar disorder. Now, on paper, and this is something that I think a lot of people who are not in the field of psychology know about. Bipolar disorder is ups and downs, extreme states. And one might say like, yeah, these are literal bipolar 2 different states. And we should definitely revisit that topic just from the information we have. I don't see that as a possibility here. Usually bipolar disorder is characterized by bouts of depression and mania. And I don't know that either, I don't see Ed Norton as someone with depression. I see him as someone who's struggling with trauma. And I don't see Hulk as someone who's struggling with mania. But maybe this is something we can hang our hat on for a little bit.
Yeah. We'll see Hulk
come back
again.
to it.
Okay, so this was a pretty good conversation for a movie that neither of us liked.
Right.
I hope everyone else enjoyed it. If you have thoughts, let us know. And Drea, why don't you tell the folks where they can let you know their thoughts on this film?
You can find me on my website, drdreapsychology.com. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at Arkham Asylum Doc.
You can find me on Twitter at Ward028. You can find me on Instagram at B_Ward028. Come find us both on Twitter at Arkham Sessions and on Instagram at The Arkham Sessions. And of course, come find us on Facebook and let us know your thoughts. Till next time, when we're going to come back to Tony Stark and talk about Iron Man 2. I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
The Arkham Sessions.
I don't want to control it. I want to get rid of it.